Moving on now to lesson 2B, learning more about arcpy, we'll be getting into other arcpy methods that are not specifically tools in the toolbox, but rather functionality that lets us work with data a little bit better, things like exists, get count, messaging, and overriding output. We learned in lesson 1 about how object-oriented programming is based on this idea of object.method or object.property. All of the tools in the toolbox that we run are methods, so it's arcpy.method is our object.method. Methods on arcpy that are not tools are also really useful. So things like checking for data existence. That's one example of a non-tool method. arcpy.toolname, any tool can be run and that is a method. Some examples of properties. Properties might include things like environment settings or describe properties. So we can set any environment setting that you would set from ArcGIS Pro, things like a current workspace or default coordinate system or a default cell size for raster data. All of those can be set using arcpy. And for environment settings, it's arcpy.env, the property name, and you use an equal sign to set the value to it. We can also retrieve properties, like the describe properties are a way to retrieve properties of the data, like the shape type or the coordinate system. We can also find out what the workspace is, what the overwrite option has been set to. There's another overwrite option, just to mention this. There's a way to allow data to overwrite or not overwrite, and that's from ArcGIS Pro. But that option, if you turn it on, is only recognized within the software, and arcpy won't see it. That's why in your code, you might want to run this option as well. Let's take a look at some of the more useful arcpy methods, some of the more common ones that are methods, but not from the toolbox, not tools. The first one, overwrite output, and so that allows data to overwrite if it already exists. And this is a handy one because very often when you write code, you're writing code and you're testing it and you're running things multiple times, and you may run steps 1 and 2, but not 3. And then you need to run it over again, and steps 1 and 2 may have created data. So overwrite output just allows that to work more easily. Exists does what it sounds like. It tells you if a data set exists or not, and it returns a Boolean, so just a true or a false. Now there's an arcpy.exists, and that will work on any data that ArcGIS can see. So it'll work on folders, it'll work on layers, it'll work on geodatabases, it'll work on rasters, but it won't work, so it'll work on any data that ArcGIS can see. There is a related exists down here at the bottom in this box from the OS module. OS will see just files, just any file. You give it a file name and an extension. If it's there, it'll say true. But the OS exists will not see data, like it won't see a layer within a geodatabase. If it sees a .shp file in a file explorer, but it's missing all the other components of a shapefile, it might say that that file exists, but it might not be valid spatial data. So the arcpy exists is better if you have spatial data that you want to know is actually existing in a spatial format. And then there's also one called describe, and we'll look at this in more depth in the next section. From the toolbox, there are a couple of toolbox tools that you would never really use as a tool by itself, but you might use them from code. Get count is one example. Make feature layer is another one, and we'll actually focus on that one more in lesson 4. But on the right, we have just a code snippet showing you an example of each of these, so you can just get an idea of how they work. So starting at the top, we're importing arcpy as well as OS. We're just setting a path to a string that represents a geodatabase. And then we are setting our workspace to that path. arcpy.env.workspace equals the path we just set. Now we can set a variable for a layer to a string for a feature class name that I know exists because I looked it up. Once the workspace is set and we have a variable for the layer, now let's try to do something with it. We can do os.path.exists, and it will tell us if this path is actually on the hard drive or not. So down at the bottom, we can see our result. What we're looking at here is a snippet from an ArcGIS notebook, so we can see the code and the result kind of all together. So does the OS see the geodatabase? True, it does. Next one, does the workspace exist according to ArcGIS? arcpy.exists, that same workspace, and yes, it does. Now we're using arcpy.exists for the layer. Does the layer exist? True. So exists will return a true or a false, which you usually wouldn't use by itself, but you will commonly use it within an if statement. If arcpy.exists, then run the tool on that data set. If not, if it doesn't exist, your else statement might be don't run the tool because the input isn't there and it won't be able to run. So exist is a really handy one and a really simple way to do just basic error checking before you run your code. Down here we have the line of code to allow data to overwrite. Simply arcpy.overwrite output, and you set it equal to true. Because it's a property, we set the property equal to some value using an equal sign. Also notice that these are case sensitive, so arcpy.exists has a capital E. arcpy.overwrite output, this O is lowercase, but the O in output is uppercase, and that has to be that way, otherwise it won't see it. The last one here, for get count, this is a really handy method to allow you to get the number of features in a layer. And if you have just a plain layer, it'll return the number of total features in that layer. If you have a selection on a layer, it will return the number selected. So we'll use this in lesson 4 and beyond as a nice way to figure out like how many features got selected, or maybe if no features got selected. The way it works is arcpy.method and then arguments. So arcpy.getCount underscore management, because this one is actually a tool coming from a toolbox, so we need the alias. In the parentheses goes the object that you want to get the count of. In this case, we have LYR, which is our streams layer. And getCount, along with a few other methods, returns what's called a result object. So it doesn't return just a number. We're going to get a number eventually, but it doesn't return a number. It returns a result object, which is a complex type of object from which we have to pull out the number. For getCount, typically you will only have one item in this object, but even if there is only one item in the object, we still have to pull out, just like we did with the string notation and the list notation with the indexing, we have to pull out the first item, and that is the count. So count result bracket 0 is the number of features that we want to get. So there's a quick overview of how each of these work. We will take a deeper look at these in the demo. In addition to print messages, there's also another way through arcpy to add messages to the geoprocessing window, and that is arcpy.addMessage, which is effectively the equivalent of a print statement. It lets you add your own text, but as you'll see later on when we get into lesson 6, print doesn't work with script tools. You have to use this add message option. And then the other one here is a way to retrieve the messaging returned from the geoprocessor. So how many of you have run a tool in ArcGIS Pro or ArcMap, and as it runs, you see little messaging like, you know, starting the tool, executing the tool, cracking features, successfully run, and a timestamp. All of that messaging that would show up in the little pop-up window in ArcGIS, you can retrieve through the arcpy.getMessages. And arcpy.getMessages with nothing in here will return every message. And then there's ways, if you look up in the help, you'll see there's ways to filter it by certain types of messaging, like the start time and end time are severity level 0. They're just like an FYI. If there were any warnings or errors, like if the data didn't exist and the tool didn't run and it threw an error that shows up in red text, there's ways to filter out only that by putting a 2 in here. So take a look at that in the help. It's just a nice way to get the real messaging back out so that you don't have to create your own messaging. Now let's hop into a demo and we'll take a quick look at workspace, overwrite, exists, get count, and add message. Now that we're in PyCharm, let's take a look at some code. I started a little demo code already. So I have my header, I have my import, and I've already set a workspace and a variable to a data set called census tract 2000. So now let's take a look at some of those arcpy methods that we just looked at in the previous slides. So number one, allow data to overwrite. So this one is a pretty easy one. And the overwrite option is an environment setting. So it's not just arcpy.overwrite, it's arcpy.env.overwrite. And notice how in PyCharm I get my little pop-up help show up, so I can just hit tab and take that. And it's a property, so I need to set the value equal to true or false. By default is false, so by not setting it, you're keeping it at false. So I'm going to set it equal to true, and then down here we're going to run a tool. So when you're running a tool, if you run the script more than once and the data already exists, then this will allow it to overwrite. In the previous slides, we also took a look at the exists method. So there's arcpy.exists to recognize specifically spatial data, in addition to the os.path.exists, and that's for just any file. We're going to focus on the arcpy one. And what we want to do down here will be to select a certain census tract by using a little SQL statement. But we want to make sure that our census tract 2000 actually exists before we try to run it. So for that, we're going to use arcpy.exists, and it's a capital E. And then in the parentheses, we'll go the name of the data set or the name of the object that we're checking. I could right here just type census tract 2000, but I have a variable. So if I have a variable, I'm going to use it. So I can just type in census right here. Now this returns a Boolean. It will return a true or a false. But what I really want to do is use that information from the Boolean, and if it's true, then run the tool. And if it's not true, then don't run the tool. So I need to put this into an if statement. So if arcpy.exists. On the end of the line, I need to add my colon, and then in the indented part, that's where I could run my tool. So all of this right here, I could highlight it, hit tab, and that's what I could do. If it exists, then run this tool. And then my else statement might be just to print out a statement. Print that data doesn't exist. There are a couple of other ways that you could do this as well, because usually if it exists, you might want to do a whole lot of things. So you might want to flip it around and say, if it doesn't exist first. So to show you how to do that, we could go back up here, and if it doesn't exist, I'm just going to cut that else statement and put it up here. Then our else statement could be running the tool. So just another way to do it that makes it a little bit easier if you have a whole lot to do for one condition and not the other. Now let's say we ran that tool. Let's take a look at the last method that we looked at on the slides, and that was getCount. If we want to return the number of features in the output, we can use getCount. And so the basic tool is getCount underscore management. There's my pop-up help. And what do we want to get the count of? We want to get the count, in this case, of the output of my select tool, which is census selection. So since I have not made a variable for it, I would actually just type in census underscore selection in quotation marks as a string. Now remember that getCount returns a result object, and the 0 index item in the result object is my actual count number. So I need to grab that out. There are a few ways to do this, including a shortcut way, but we're going to spell everything out just because when you're learning, it's easier. So we're going to call it count result will be equal to the result of this tool. And then we can print out a little statement. The number of selected features is, and then a plus sign, and then we can put in our count result. Count result, and grab the number out of it with our index, our bracket 0. But now count result is a number, and we're adding it to a string, so we also have to do this. So something like that, and maybe a space. And maybe quotation marks, that would help. Quotation marks would help. Something like that should get us where we need to be. Now let's run this and see what it does. So we'll right click, run from right here. The run window opens and it's starting. And I get my error that the data doesn't exist because I did my if exists. And then look what I get. I get a big red error. So when you write your scripts, you want to try to avoid these big ugly blocks of red error code. So that's why we want to use things like if something exists or doesn't exist, we can tell it what error to give. Now the reason that this error is happening is because when we ran our code, we said if the data doesn't exist, print out an error, and only if it does exist, run the tool. But then down below, we're looking for the count of the features in the result. But the result didn't get created because this tool didn't run. And so that's why we're getting this big block of red text. So if you get this, it's okay, but you do need to know how to sift through it to find what you're looking for. So if you look right here, input rows, data set, census selection does not exist or is not supported. That is your clue right there as to what the problem is. And it says failed to execute get count. So it's telling you what tool failed and why it failed. And it will also tell you up here, line 36 is the line that it failed on. So I can go back up to here and I can see what happened. So if you do get this error, don't despair, just read through it and figure out what the problem is. Now let's fix it so that it does run. The problem is my path is incorrect because I moved my data. It should actually be this. Because everything has variables now and it's all relative to this path, I can easily update one path and everything else will work. Let's also go back down here. Notice, I didn't mention this before, but we mentioned it on the slide. Notice that I have a try except statement. So try to run my select tool. And if it doesn't work, then arcpy.get messages. So what this is going to do is return any messaging that the geoprocessor would provide. Now we can get the messages whether it works or not. So let's actually print out everything just so we can see what it does. And by having the 2 in here, what it means is only get the errors, only get any errors like what we have down here where the reason why it failed. If we leave this blank, then it'll get everything, and let's see what that looks like. So right-click Run. It's restarting. It's running that tool, and that was a print statement that I put above it, starting select. And notice what I have. Start time, succeeded at, and then there's my print statement. So this is really friendly. So now I can see exactly how long it took, and I have my own messaging with that print statement that's coming from down here. So this is good user feedback. You can format it even a little bit better, but I checked to see if the data were there. It is there, so it ran the tool, it gave me my messaging, and then at the bottom it printed everything out. Wonderful. Notice also at the bottom that it says process finished with exit code 0. Exit code 0 means there were no error codes, which means it ran successfully with no errors, and that means you are good to go. Now let's continue on with the next part of the lesson where we will talk about describe.